Welcome to another edition of the Spiritual Abuse Podcast. My name is Eddie.
And I'm Joseph. And today we're having a guest that was actually one of my groomsmen at my wedding, Samuel Prithiv. He's a dear friend of mine. We went to college together. We've had a lot of deep theological, existential, philosophical discussions together. And he's just a great, sincere guy.
I had some of those when all your groomsmen were staying in our house before the wedding. That was some of my favorite times. That was awesome.
Yeah, that was how many guys were staying at your house?
What was it? 7, 8? I'm not sure. And it was a small house. It was a very small house.
Yeah.
Sam, you'll be glad to know we live in a bigger house now. So
amazing. Okay, another reason to come to Lebanon.
Yes.
There you go. But yeah, we're excited to have him on the podcast. He's worked with a couple of different churches and had some interesting experiences, which we'll get into. But yeah, just want to welcome my friend Sam. So Sam, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Joseph, and thank you, Eddie. It's really good to be here. And this is the first time I'm on a podcast that's addressing this question. I think it's important. So yeah, let's get into it, man. I'm excited to where this is going to go.
So first question right off the bat, tell us a little bit about yourself. What did you go to school for? What are you passionate about? What are you doing now? Just a little background.
Yeah, I actually initially went to school for engineering, biotech engineering, but then my passion is really music. And so I went to Oral Roberts University in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and initially for music, and then I switched to international community development. So that was my major, and my two minors were theology, and my other minor was music. And I'm just passionate about helping people make meaning and drawing a narrative of their lives and drawing meaning from their pain, because I think a lot of pain is wasted or run away from. So I mean that's all-encompassing answer. But
So Sam, anyone who's listening in is going to notice that, as they say here in Tennessee, it doesn't sound like you're from around here. So where are you from, so our listeners know exactly where you come from?
I'm from Bangalore, India. So I was here for 19 years. I lived in the US for 6 years. So more of a TKC, as they would call it, a third culture kid, or TKK. But yeah, I've been back in India for the last year and a half. So India most of my life, and a little bit in the US.
And what are you doing in India right now?
Right now, I actually work for a university. It's called Kriya University, and I am part of their student life office. So everything that has to do with mental health, to student engagement, to helping students really make meaning outside the classroom. That's really what my role is about. So it's a really cool opportunity. I've been here for a year, and I think I'll be here for the near future. It's kind of isolated, this campus, but there are a lot of beautiful things around, a lot of natural things, and this urban boy is pretty excited.
How big is the campus?
It's not too big. It's like 40 acres.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's a
How many students?
Sorry?
And how many students?
I think it's about it's 240 for undergraduate program and about 300 for the graduate program.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
Awesome. So real quick before we get into the topic of spiritual abuse and all that stuff, just what's the craziest story that you can recall back in college? Because I know when I was on the same floor as you on Repub, we had some pretty crazy stories.
The craziest story from college, man. I don't know.
For the listeners out there, Joseph and Samuel, they went to Oral Roberts University, so their definition of crazy story is different than crazy stories.
That's why I wanted to ask it.
From the University of Texas or University of Tennessee. It's going to be probably a little bit different.
Well, this isn't really that crazy, but this is part of our initiation on the floor. There was this one night, so I was the chaplain on this floor, right? And there was one night we had this week-long initiation, and they asked us to get into these onesies, and they blindfolded us. We didn't know where we were going. We were all wearing like these weird like pajama onesies, So I think mine had like bunny ears on. It was yellow, and yeah, it paints a pretty picture for you. And we would just put in these cars. They didn't tell us anything, and then we smelled like alcohol and cigarettes, and then I was like, where are we, right? And we drove for about 20 minutes, and then we arrived at this place, and they take off our blindfolds, and our entire sister, like, you could say sister sorority, but it's more of a sister wing. We didn't have sororities and fraternities at our university, but they were all just sitting there in front of us, and we're at a Buffalo Wild Wings, and we were required to sing karaoke at random Buffalo Wild Wings in front of strangers in these onesies, and so one of them sang "My Humps" by the Black Eyed Peas, and actually I got to sing "I Will Always Love You" by Whitney Houston, and
Oh my gosh.
I forcefully made this waitress dance with me, and yeah, that was a pretty. It's not a crazy story, but it's a pretty sweet memory. We
Yeah,
Is
I
laughed
there a
about
remember.
video of this?
it. I don't know. I don't know. It's a long time ago. It was in
Okay.
2015. That's a long time ago. Wow. Okay.
Yeah, and I remember when you guys. So when I was on the floor and you did initiation for me, I remember you guys doing the same thing, essentially kidnapping us and doing various things. And I remember we were taken at the top of this huge mountain, blindfolded. You guys were guiding us. We were shirtless, and it was like pitch black at night. We had no idea where we were going. And we finally get to the top of this mountain. We just hear like a fire crackling, and you guys take the blindfolds off of us, and you write the floor name and ash on our chest, and give us a dog tag. And it was like a
What was
it
it
was
called?
it was such a sweet bonding moment
Oh, okay. I
between
was
the
gonna
two
say
of
it
us.
sounded like a cult, but that too.
Yeah, that too. But we definitely did as crazy as you could at a squeaky clean Christian university, and
Squeaky
that was
clean.
fun.
Yeah. Say that again.
uh,
So
okay, well, thank you. That's
yeah,
awesome.
Eddie, is that crazy
So
enough for you? Was that
Well, your stories are a little bit different than my college stories, but I'm glad. I would rather have your stories. How's that?
Oh, really? Oh, okay. All right. Okay. Cool.
So,
so oh, go
I
ahead.
have a
What were you gonna
question
say?
for Sam before we get started because I want our
Yeah.
listeners to know. Sam, you are uh, a student from India that is now taking classes in the United States. Uh, I know that when you all went out for Joseph's bachelor party, which was again a squeaky clean bachelor party, that you
Yeah.
guys actually encountered some racism in downtown Nashville. So, as a someone from another country who is now in the heartland of the United States, what kind of racism did you see towards you because you were not an American?
So actually, just a few points of clarification. Thanks for your question, Eddie. I don't think I was there when they went to downtown Nashville, actually.
Oh, okay, all right. Was that
Yeah. I think that was a few of the others. And yeah. So in Oklahoma, to be honest, I never experienced anything overtly racist. Um, I think I think I think in terms of applying for things or applying for worship teams, I definitely felt like I did have a certain level of competency, but they weren't able to fit me in a certain genre, and that might have been where I'm from. I'm not pinning that on that, but I did. I mean, there were a few times where I would be encouraged to apply for a worship team, and then I wouldn't get it. And this happened about two times for the same worship team. Um, but then I don't know if I didn't experience anything overtly racist, but I will say this. Um, when I would go into supermarkets, I would go into really public spaces. I think the university or Roberts University is a pretty safe space, right? It's a pretty protected bubble. Um, but when I would go out into public, and when my last two girlfriends have been white, pretty white. So we would get these weird looks, and it wasn't like people were saying anything, but you could almost feel eyeballs on the back of like you could feel them boring into the back of your skull. Like you would just feel it. So I mean there was definitely that, but yeah, nothing really to write home about. Um, I had a really solid group of international friends and American friends, and so yeah, God is really gracious in providing that for me.
Okay, that's good. That's actually a good story. I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Awesome. So, Sam, one of your many passions is international community development, right? Didn't you study something along the lines? I know you changed your major and you did a lot of stuff like
Yeah,
that, but
I
did you?
switched it twice, but I ended up with international community development. Yeah.
Okay, so before we kind of jump into kind of like your experience in a couple of churches, in a few words, how could you sum up, international community development for people who haven't heard of that specialty?
It's a mix of what a social work degree would look like if it was if the context of a local like nation was removed. It was more internationally focused on like the UN and the Human Rights Declaration, and it's a mix of. Sorry, this is a complicated definition, but it's a mix of economics, um, social work, and nonprofit management.
Oh, okay. And what specifically drew you to studying international community development?
To be honest, I think 1 year into I wasn't a believer before I think came to the US. I was about 18 when I came to the US, and I think yeah I really started walking with Jesus when I was through my 19th year, and God really drew my heart to North Korea, just randomly. And I knew, I mean, there were multiple signs from scripture, from people, from different, just from different avenues. And it was all pointing to North Korea. And I just felt this drawing there. And it, so that's honestly, that's the reason I picked international community development because I sensed that there'd be um, a lot of work to do in North Korea once the nation starts opening up. And interestingly enough, it's been opening up a lot more in the last few years,
Hmm.
um, as a country in terms of a market and in terms of how easy it is for people to get out. Recently, during COVID, it's been a lot harder. Things have changed. It's a lot harder for people to get out, but on the whole, it's been on the up and up.
Okay. Wow, that's really cool. So I didn't know that. So did you become a Christian or a believer at ORU? Or was
Yeah,
it was
yeah,
it
no, really, yeah. So I grew up in church. Obviously, I think I've told you this. My dad's a pastor actually, and we part of this church that grew from I think a few hundreds in the 1990s to about 25,000 now. It's one of the biggest in the country. Um,
Wow.
and
wow.
yeah, but I grew up around Christian culture and what Kierkegaard calls Christendom. But I really wasn't a believer. Yeah.
Does Christendom look different in India than it does in the United States?
Um, yes and no. Yes, in terms I think there's almost an unhealthy inclination towards hero worship or the idolization of pastors, like on a level that is like not incomparable to the United States. I know it happens in the United States as well, but here it's another level. Like anything that
Really?
the pastor says goes. Yeah.
See, I actually thought you were talking about the United States
Yeah,
because
yeah,
we're,
no,
we're
no,
seeing
no. It's on a
we're
different
see,
level. I mean, that's also part of our culture as well, just idolizing people and people. I really feel like that comes from our Hindu roots, which is why you see a lot of Hollywood celebrities embracing Hinduism. Is the fact that they want to feel divine, like the divine's in everything, so they want to achieve that godlike status. So anyway, I mean, you can find people in India. They would when famous celebrities die, you there are a lot of sadly there are a lot of people who commit suicide, um, because they
Wow.
see them as divine. Yeah, and so that bleeds into the Christian, into the church as well. That's something that's uh, almost it's similar, but it's on a really a lot higher level that it happens here.
So can you give an example just from like what you've experienced in the U.S., studying in the U.S. for a few years, and then growing up in India, of how it's. Can you give an example of how it is much more, how it's different in India, like this
Yeah,
hero worship
so
and all
I
this
mean,
stuff?
in the U.S., there's still a sense of, I think this is one of its strengths. I think it might be changing now, but uh, there's a sense of fairness and there's a sense of, I guess, I would even say sanity in terms of what is credible from a pastor and what is not credible. Like the credibility of a pastor based on how close they are to scripture, or what they're the point that they're trying to make, or if they're trying to be provocative. If so there's no uh, there's no measurement of just there's not much discernment in India, I would say. I mean, this is a large statement. There's obviously communities where there is, but a lot of new believers and the majority of the Christians will just believe anything the pastor says, um, as opposed to really looking at the Bible and critically thinking about um, what what they're saying, if it's theologically sound, if it fits into the core truths of Christianity. So that's one I think difference from the idol worship that happens in the U.S. and here.
Mm.
Um,
It just doesn't seem that different to me, but
yeah,
I might have a biased, tainted view, which I'm at least intellectual enough to understand that based on my experience, I I might see things because I've seen people who elevate pastors to a level of a hero, and uh, and even in cases of where the pastor has made a misstep, they will still defend to the end in a kind of a blind loyalty. And I've seen that all across the United States, and now we're coming into a rash of pastors who are being exposed for, they use the word in the church, moral failures, and the people don't know how to handle it, and they'll still defend them to the end. There's always going to be people in that camp, so it just gets me thinking. But I find this a fascinating discussion on the church culture of India versus the United States, because
Yeah.
yeah.
I think it sounds like they're different, but it also sounds like they're incredibly similar as well.
Yeah. So, um,
Uh, yeah, if I
Sam.
could
Oh,
say
okay.
something about that, I mean,
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
to comment on that really quick. Sorry, Joseph. Um,
No, you're good.
I still feel like there's a healthy, at least with the general population, maybe it's just the circles. I mean, I haven't done a study or a survey of Christians in the United States, but I feel like there's a general skepticism that's shared by the culture there. Even, I mean, even when it comes down to security guards, right? If there's some unusual activity in a neighborhood, like a security guard will come up, or like someone will come up and ask you, "Hey, what are you doing here?" In India, that's really not so common. And I mean, that's a over kind of extrapolation, but I feel like there's a healthy skepticism that's there in the present in the United States.
Can you recall an example of hero worship in India from a certain pastor?
I don't know if I want to name anyone.
No, 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 not don't name anybody, but just like describe a situation, just to kind of give an example.
Oh yeah, even in terms of the coronavirus, dude. Um, People just they just kept going to church because they felt like God is going to protect them from the virus. And I know that's similar to what's happening in the U.S. in some of the churches. But yeah, I mean that happens here as well. And these were educated, sound, reasonable people who would just be like, "Yeah, the pastor said so, and Jesus is going to protect us from the virus." And a bunch of people got infected, and some of them died from the virus. So
Sheesh. Wow.
yeah.
So real quickly, I guess last question on this subject, from a theological standpoint, because from where I see American theology and American Christianity, it's very individualistic. It's very what's the word? It's very denominational. It's very autonomous. It's really it's not colonial, but it's like, in other words, I can't think of the word, but basically like American missionaries when they go to a foreign country, they take the idea of our Christianity is the best, and not only our Christianity but our culture. So when they want to Christianize a culture, they Americanize a culture. It's that colonial mindset, and it's very elitist and prideful. Based on your studies in the United States, what are the theological differences between like Indian theology? Like, what are the emphases in India from their theology of Scripture versus our emphases in America? Where do you see a contrast? Just briefly.
Wow, it's a big question, man. And I have to think about that one. But um, to be honest, so the actually backtracking a little bit to the second question, that the second part of the question that Eddie asked me. I mean, I named you a difference. Um, the similarity I would say is because of just from a cultural standpoint. I think the world derives a lot of its culture from the United States, and I mean specifically from a lot from Los Angeles and a lot of the movies that come out of there in New York, and the
Oh,
shows that come
interesting.
out of New York. And so the church culture is like that as well. And so in terms of emphasis, you would see very large similarities between churches in United States and the churches in India as well. There's a lot of name it, claim it, and I'm talking about the the prosperity gospel. You see that very commonly in India as well. Um, there although there's one stark difference in terms of um, there are a lot of new believers in India, and so even though Christianity has been here for 2,000 years, um, so Thomas the disciple is who brought Christianity here. I mean, there are a lot of Jesuits and people like that who came later, but Thomas the disciple is the first one to come. Um, um, India is not saturated in a Christian culture, right? There, it's still pretty it's still pretty ancient in a lot of ways. But in terms of, man, I lost my train of thought. What were we just talking about? Sorry. Um,
Emphases, theological emphasis in India
I was talking
versus
about
the
the
United
difference.
States.
You're right. So in
Yeah.
terms of, I think in terms of embracing persecution and self-preservation, there's a marked difference. And this is not all encompassing. I think in the cities, a lot of the mega churches, a lot of them tend to be on the prosperity gospel side or name it, claim it. There are a lot of mega churches that are doing very important missionary work that are able to, really exercise their resources and um, mobilize mobilize their networks to make change. But um, but there's the other side where the new believers that are in the more remote areas, in villages, in towns, where they really take Jesus' words really seriously. Where they say, they take when they persecuted, they don't report it. And so when Jesus says, in this world you have trouble, but take heart, for I will overcome the world. They embrace that wholeheartedly. So um, I mean, I can give you an example of I believe this story is from the Northeast. If I can share this, is that okay?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So and I think Hillsong did a cover of this song, like did a remake of this song. Um, have you heard of the hymn "I Have Decided to Follow Jesus"?
Yes, I have.
So
That
the
is, I grew up in a Methodist church, so that
okay,
was part of what we sang.
okay. So do you know the story behind that song?
I do not.
Okay, so there was this missionary. I don't know where the missionary is from, but I believe this was in the northeastern part of India that the missionary came to, and there was one family in that whole village that had accepted Christ as their savior, and they were living a different life. They were the only believers in the whole village. Uh, when the minute the missionary left, the whole village came to the doorstep of this family. So it was a husband, a wife, and two children, two little children. I believe I think they were 3 and 5 years old. And um, they asked them to come out, and they tied all of them on these stumps, these wooden stumps, and asked them to renounce the name of Jesus. And the husband says, "I have um, I have decided to follow Jesus. No turning back, no turning back." And then they kill both. The archers come. They murder both his children in front of his eyes. And they say, "Hey, you still have your wife. You can still make more children, but just denounce Jesus, and we'll let you go." Um, he says, um, "Though none go with me, still I will follow. No turning back, no turning back." And so they kill his wife, and they tell him, "Hey, you can marry again. Uh, you just denounce Jesus." Then he says, um, um, what was the last the words of him? Um, the cross before me, the world behind me, no turning back, no turning back. And so this Indian, so the words, his last words, they killed him, executed him as well. And because of the faith, his faith and his family's faith, the whole village ended up accepting Christ. And so that is what the hymn is based on. And so I mean that's one of the myriad examples of people who really embrace persecution as a part of following Jesus. And I think that's a marked difference between the new believers or the believers in a lot of these remote areas and the missional believers in India and the pastors in India.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's a really awesome, fascinating distinction. Specifically on the topic of spiritual abuse in your life and in your family's lives, because I know that your family was very involved in ministry with you growing up. I remember you telling me about an experience that your family had at the church that you were involved in growing up. Can you kind of describe your experiences at that church, particularly the spiritual abuse that you saw going on there?
Sure. I think, yeah, I mean, I get sentimental when I think about this because everything I knew about Christianity for a significant 19 years of my life was 19 years of my life was from this church. And my father was actually I mean his gifts are in preaching and teaching, but he didn't feel like he was being used in his gifts. Um, his his background was from the hotel industry, but he God has blessed us beyond anything we can imagine. But he did leave a pretty lucrative career just to become a pastor to join this church, and and so he was used. The reason I say that he was used more as an administrator rather than someone who preaches and teaches, which was really his gifting. And this went on for a really, really, really long time. This went on for about 25 years, and he just felt like he wasn't being used in what he was called to. And so, difficult as it was, he left. And at this point, I had just spent a year in the United States, and I'd gone back for the summer. And
And how many years was your family involved at this church?
oh man, since '85, I think, until
Wow.
2014. But my dad officially worked, I think, for 20 years. I think they were with them, working officially.
Wow.
Yeah. So, yeah, I was in the US for a year, and then I went back, and man, I was treated so differently. Just really cold shoulders. I Yeah, I almost couldn't recognize the place that I went to. I was treated very differently when I was a pastor's kid in this church, in this mega church, and versus when I was just a regular member. And I mean, it wasn't. I don't know if I'd classify that as spiritual abuse because it wasn't an ongoing thing, but it was different, definitely pretty hurtful and. Uh, Tainted my view of a mega church,
Mm.
and how sustainable it is. How sustainable is it in terms of being able to love and help people feel accepted and really being um, an organic part of the body of Christ.
Yeah.
Otherwise
Can you give?
it
Oh,
becomes
go ahead.
a corporate machine,
Y-
and so yeah.
Yeah. Do you feel like that you were treated that way as because you were no longer a pastor's kid, or were you treated that way because it was kind of a punishment based on your dad making the choice to no longer be a part of that? And I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, nor am I trying to form a narrative. I'm just trying to understand what you think the root reason was on that.
Oh, I mean, yeah. I mean, when I say I wasn't a pastor's kid anymore, I think I was talking about, I was alluding to the second point, of what second part of what you just said. The fact that my dad wasn't really a part of it. Um, so, I mean, that was pretty, really, really hard. And yeah, I needed to really critically think about um, that. The first distinction there was between who Christ is and what a church in the body of Christ can do, what it can't do for you, and how important is that to your faith, and how important is that to your relationship with God, right? So, thankfully, by that time, I think I was a new believer, and the whole new believer energy, I was able to just, yeah, it
You were very
wasn't.
resilient.
Yeah, you have this energy, man. I don't even know how to put words to it, but you have this energy that can just kind of, this momentum that's just like, that just kind of carried me through that. But I mean, it still left this void because my family moved to that city, the city of Bangalore, just because of that church. Um, so it was hard. It still is hard. I'm in touch with very few people from there, but it is what it is, and I don't know if it's an easy answer.
How specifically did they treat you differently? Like, can you describe that a little bit more detail?
I mean, suddenly I wasn't allowed to go to certain, floors. I'd just be hanging with my friends who were other pastors' kids, and they'd be like, "Hey, you can't go here," or I wouldn't be invited to certain things, or um, people were just kind of cold. I think pretty passive. It was kind of passive aggressive. So it wasn't overt because I mean they can't do anything overt, but um, yeah.
So you felt this distinct, tangible distancing from yourself. It was almost like a collective distancing from a community that you grew up with, that your parents moved to a new city to help start this church, and that your family invested so much, like almost everything in, like your whole life. I was wrapped into this a lot, I would imagine. And that, like, I know you said that you don't characterize that as spiritual abuse, but when you are just, when something is just so much a part of your life growing up, especially in childhood, and you experience that distancing, almost like a shunning, not a complete shunning because they were still talking to you, but like that distancing, like there's something wrong with you, that, like you said, that can really taint a lot of things or plant seeds or just really be hard to process. I can imagine.
Yeah, and that's kind of what Hannah's going through right now, in the sense that, you know, growing up, the first 21 years of her life with in a certain location with a certain group of people, and then when you go, you know what, I'm just not going to be a part of this anymore. Then all those relationships that you thought were kingdom lifelong relationships that were based on mutual interest and all that were basically more proximity relationships, and they can't get past the hurt of someone either leaving or speaking out and saying something about something, even if it's something that will help the church. People can't get by that. It's kind of like that what you were talking about with the people worship and the loyalty. Because if you leave a place, then that is sometimes looked at as a disloyal or a betrayal, and
Yeah.
it's a weird thing.
So why did your dad decide to, was it his decision to not be a pastor anymore? Was your family still attending the church when
He's
you
still
came
he's still a
back?
pastor. Sorry,
Oh,
sorry. I'll let you finish that. Your family?
So your dad was still a pastor. They just distanced themselves from you because you went and studied somewhere else, or what was the
Oh,
reason?
no, 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 no. My dad, he stopped being a pastor at that church. He continued
Oh,
being a
okay,
pastor.
okay.
Yeah, yeah. He continued
Oh,
mentoring other
gotcha.
pastors.
Okay.
He started traveling a lot more and preaching and teaching and really moving in his gift. And he's getting his doctorate in ministry right now.
Oh, okay. So he stepped down. Did he voluntarily step down from that church to pursue his own
Yes,
ministry?
yes, yes, yes.
Oh, okay. Wow. And it sounds like they weren't very supportive of that, like the church as a
No,
whole.
no, no, no. I
Mm.
mean, honestly, the relationship now with the senior pastor is much better. And my dad, like, they're on
Okay,
really good
good.
terms, which is very different to a lot of people that left that church. Um, yeah, so that's, I mean, that's a redemptive part of the story. So, I mean, I don't know if there's been complete reconciliation, but there's still contact and they still work together on a few projects. But
Oh, that's good.
yeah, yeah.
That's good.
Um,
Okay, I do have a sidebar question that completely gets us off the track, but I've got to know this. So, Samuel, you said you grew up in a family, you grew up with the church, your parents were pastors at this church in the ministry, but you didn't become a believer until you were 19 years old. So, most church kids, most pastor kids, PKs, they all get born again when they're 7 years old. So, why did it take 19 years?
I don't know. You
That's a
should,
great answer.
I think that's a good question to ask God. But anyway, no, I'm just kidding. Uh, I don't know. I mean, there's this quote that always comes to my mind when I think about this. I think C.S. Lewis says it this way. He says, Christianity is like the sun. You can't see it, but by it you can see everything else. And I think until I was 19 years old, I mean, I had had some hard experiences, um, I, but God just, I think He really just reached and pursued me when I was at university in the U.S. I started questioning more things. I started asking questions about life. I started reading books. I started reading books in general. I never used to read. I started writing things. It was like the sun. Like I could see everything else, um, because the sun had just almost someone had just turned on the sun for me, and that was Jesus Christ. And to be honest, I don't know. I think at some level it was dormant. It was just dormant in my heart. The uh, one of the earliest memories I have is I don't know why this is coming to my mind as you ask this question, but there was a strong sense. Um, Let me share the memory and I'll tell you what I took from it. But it was probably when I was 6 years old, and we were just coming outside church, and um, I had a popsicle in my hand. I still remember it was an orange popsicle, and I was eating it, and there were these two kids that were begging um, outside the church. They were asking for money. They were asking for food as well. I remember giving my I was eating this popsicle already, and they wanted that popsicle, and so I gave it to them, and they literally broke it in their hands and like scarfed it down in a matter of seconds. In a matter of seconds. I had never seen that, and my 6 or 7 year old brain just kind of short circuited. I was like, this isn't right. And I don't know. I believe that was the Holy Spirit speaking to me and saying, hey, I I want to establish my kingdom through your will, right? Know that, like, the goodness of God leads men to repentance, and so reflecting in my life and seeing that God is being pursued, like pursuing me through that, and pursuing me through His call almost. So I'm sorry, that was a lot. I don't know if that made total sense, but that was really, I think it was just dormant for a long time. But I always knew He was there. Um,
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense to me.
Yeah. So I think based off of our talks, I think what you experienced in that church, that distancing, that was like the beginnings of um, a lot of the spiritual abuse you experienced. From what I've known in your story, you've experienced a lot of things that blindsided you, that took you off guard, that were really hurtful in the U.S., especially when you started working at churches. So can you kind of describe just your experiences in working at churches in the U.S., how that affected your faith, how it how that affected your faith and the journey that you went on, because it was kind of a bumpy ride while you were here, if I
Yeah,
remember.
it was. So, um, I mean, as I was telling you, I think I was a new believer, and I one of the first things was after so the first summer after I became a believer was back in India, and then this whole experience with this church that I grew up in, and so I had just started attending a Korean church in the U.S. and I was there for about 2 years, I think. I started serving in the youth ministry, led worship for them, and they did help me with my missions trip and all of that. But I think at some level, and as I mentioned, God really moved in my heart to like uh, to 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 join him in his healing process in North Korea, and that's the reason I think I forced myself to go to this Korean church because I was like, North Korea, logic tells me I need to learn Korean, I need to learn about Korean culture. And man, that was difficult. It was like I had never felt this. I was the darkest person in the room. There was one other American girl at that church for a whole year, and the service was in Korean, everything was in Korean. And I mean they had translators, but I could hardly understand it. So for 2 years, 1 year into being a new believer, for 2 years, I felt like I wasn't being spiritually fed. And I, I don't know. I just came away from that. Honestly, that was the start of a lot of my mental health issues, and I didn't realize this. Every time I felt the need to go to another church or somewhere where I could be more spiritually alive, I'd have this picture of myself on a boat. And I mean, you can chalk this up to Savior Complex, but this is the picture I had ferrying people across, or helping people across the Yangtze River, which is where the Yellow River is where people cross from North Korea to China. That's most,
Hmm.
like, yeah, so most of the people that escape North Korea go that way. So I had this picture in my head. So I would force myself to go to this church, and nobody, literally nobody reached out and to be honest, I would say I didn't make it known either because I didn't feel like I would be understood because everything was in Korean, irrespective of what, irrespective of like them helping in the mission trip. The Americans felt this as well, and this turned into a big deal a few years later. But I was there when there was just one other American there. We always felt like outsiders. Um, always felt like the guest, irrespective of whether I was serving the youth ministry. So there was a church where I was constantly pouring the youth ministry and leading worship, and every week going and pouring myself whatever I had in me, and I wasn't getting much back. Maybe I could have vocalized it, but yeah, I ended up quitting that church 2 years in, just because I was spiritually just
So
ringed out almost.
were you volunteering or working there?
I was volunteering at that church. Yeah, I was just volunteering. I wasn't
And
working.
how many hours a week do you think you volunteered there?
Uh, Probably 5 to 6 hours.
Okay.
Probably five to
Yeah.
six hours. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So you were decently involved in this church in for 2 years, and you didn't feel like you were integrated or considered like part of the family.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So, yeah, a lot of my mental health, I think, issues. I mean, I'm not going to put it on the church, but it did exacerbate. I think that environment did exacerbate a lot of it, because socially I felt really, really out of place. Um, but yeah, thankfully, I did find a church after that. And I mean, I guess can I mention the name of the church if it's a good example?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
Sure.
Church 3434 with Pastor Jeff Voth.
Hmm.
I mean, it was just a really, really healing experience for me. He treated me like his son, and I got to be part of the worship team there, and really involved with their um, with different initiatives and different projects that they'd be running as well, with the youth ministry as well. So yeah, that was a really healing experience for me for the next 2 years. But yeah, that's a little bit about. I'm sure you guys have lot more questions.
Sure. Yeah. And then, so you served at this Korean church, then you went to church 3434. And then was it after that? Because I remember, try to help me put this experience together. I remember you had like a traumatic event and it made you feel like it wasn't necessarily in the church, but made it feel like, God, where are you? And it made you like question your faith and all that stuff. And then after that, I think you were on staff at a church and then they treated you an interesting way. And then you came back to India. Am I remembering that part of
Yes,
your story
yes,
right?
yes, yes.
I want to kind of dive into that too,
Sure, sure,
real
sure.
quick before we talk more about the Korean church as well.
Oh, okay. So we can shift gears. So this was after um, my graduation actually. So I started working for this church, and it was right up my alley. It was a missions position. It was a missions pastor position, um, and I mean, my boss and I had an amazing relationship. Um, there was this man. Okay, so uh, we need visas, right? A lot of international we as international students we need visas to work in the United States, and visas are a lot of work. They require a lot of money, and they require legal help as well. And so, thankfully, I had a year of job searching. I lived in LA for some time, really struggled to find a job there. I'd come back to Tulsa, um, actually, finally, towards the end of the period that I'm allowed to be in the US before, like, there's a year after my graduation that you're allowed to be in the US to find a full-time job and get your visa and all of that sorted. So towards the end of my last year in the US, this opportunity came up, and on paper it looked amazing. I really liked the boss. Um, uh, I we were waiting for my visa to get sorted, and a month or two after I got accepted to my position, the HR office just calls me and they're like, "Oh, we can't do your visa." I'm like, this this doesn't make any sense because like I'd have to go back, I'd have to pack my bags and go home, um, if that did happen. Um, and I mean, and I have a huge loan to pay off, so this is a lot of pressure. They were just like, "Oh, we can't do your visa anymore." And so I call my boss and I'm like, "Hey, this is what I heard from the HR office. Like, what do we do?" And this is a mega church, right? This is one of the biggest churches in Tulsa. Um, and I, I mean, when this happens this was, I think, actually, yeah, this was just before that happened. Anyway, so I go off the rails a little bit. I don't feel comfortable sharing it on here, but I go a little reckless, um, um, because I was dealing with a lot of anxiety at that point, a lot of uncertainty, and I mean, I will say, I mean, it exacerbated my propensity to make a wrong choice, and yeah, I really really fell hard, and then I mean, 2 weeks later they were just like very casually like, "Oh yeah, I'm sorry, there was just a mistake. We can do your visa," and the management just decided to change their mind randomly. So finally, all the paperwork gets sorted, and I start working for this church. Um, I like the role. I'm really learning a lot. I'm doing whatever I can in it. My boss and I have a really good relationship. And then 2 or 3 months, I had my visa for the next 2.5 years. I just got a job. I just got a house. The day I actually the I just got a car. Like I was about to sign the papers on a car. It was a Lincoln Town car, and it was this massive V8. It was this boat of a
Nice.
car. It was really nice. It was a gangster car. Like no one would mess with me if I had that car.
That's an
But
old person car right there.
it is a bit of an old soul. So yeah, and I mean, and mind you, in the last the this was November of 2018, and the months preceding this, I had just gone through a massive breakup with someone I was really serious with, and I had just gotten into a massive accident that almost I could have very, very easily died. So God really protected me that I walked out of that a scratch. So these two experiences were just before this. I signed the papers for the car, like I'd almost signed the papers for the car on that day, and I get this call from this church, and they're like, "Hey, we need an emergency meeting. You need to come over." I go to the church, no warning, nothing, and they're just like, "Hey, we've had a $15 million budget cut, and I'm sorry, but your position was cut, and this was one of the other few positions that were cut, right? This was one of the many positions that were cut." Um, and that just broke me, man. They just said, I mean, we'll pay you for the next 2 weeks, and then you're done. And in Oklahoma, there are not much labor laws, and um, at this point, I was involved in the youth ministry. I had left the church that I was part. I'd left 34, where I really flourished because I was working for the church, so I really wanted to be the part of the community there as well, and it was close to where I lived now. So I was also a member of the church, but I really felt like, considering everything that was going on in my life as well, I don't know, I just felt like I was more of a cog in a big machine, in a corporate machine, rather than, a member of a church. I think, and
Did it feel more like they were making a business decision than an actual person decision? Because I'm looking at all the things that you have to do as an international, who is has to have visas and other things to stay here in the United States. And I know that churches need to make cuts and it's business and budgets and all that. I get all that. But wow, with someone who has to have certain things in order to stay in the United States, that
Yeah.
that would be a tough, tough thing to go through.
yeah, thanks, Eddie. Yeah, and I mean, I'm giving them the benefit of the doubt. I don't think they knew that I would have to leave. I mean, I'm sure they didn't care enough to know that I would have to leave the country if they.
That's the key phrase right there. They didn't care enough to know. And that was going to be one of my next questions was how long were you at this church? How involved were you beyond being on staff? Like how many hours a week did you work?
Oh,
Like how integrated were you?
I was full time, plus
Okay.
I was doing worship for the youth. So I'd gone on camps with them, and like I was all in, man.
And how long were you at this church?
About 7 months.
Oh, okay. So a decent amount of time. And how would you say the staff culture was? Like did you feel warmly invited into the staff culture, or did you kind of feel more like just an employee? Or
Honestly, my boss and I were really good. Most of the staff were okay. There was one person that was pretty hostile, and I have a sense that they might have, kind of. I don't know of anyone else that was cut from the thing. They just said it was a budget cut. It was. I mean, I don't know. I'm not aware of any till date. I'm not aware of anyone else that was cut. So I don't know if it was initiated by that person. But anyway, I don't. Yeah. There wasn't any effort on their side to help me look at even other options. Because I stayed for 3 months after that. I mean, I worked two jobs. I worked at a restaurant, and I valeted, just to be able to get by. And during that time, I was trying to find a way where this other organization was willing to pay me to work for them, but through this church, if there's a legal way to do that. And the church wasn't willing to do that. And I was the one who initiated that. And I had like all my self-esteem was on the table for even for that conversation, and they weren't
Mm-hmm.
willing to have that. Um, there were two people in the entire church that I think reached out to me after this. Um, but yeah, I mean that experience still recovering from. I still, I mean, I got an offer when I came back here, one of the really, really well-respected churches. I had two offers actually from that church, but I'm still like once bitten too shy. Like I don't know if I want to go to a church because I feel like there's so much theater that's involved. There's so much theater that's involved. It's just it's become a play that only appeals to a certain demographic, to the church
Mm.
demographic. It's a play with a lot of high jargon, a lot of high theological sounding jargon that only appeals to a social club. And I feel like that's just what I've seen, and it's really hard. I mean, God is really slowly drawing me back, but it's been such a long and just nuanced, hard process. Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
yeah, allow me to say something. First of all, I'm sorry that happened to you because I know that it just hurts. And, I'm not comparing my story to your story, but I've been a volunteer for 20 some years in a church, and then I've been a paid employee at a church. And it's just, it's just tough. And your story, I'm going to pull back because I don't want to take away from your story and make it about me. But I will tell you this. Right now I work a regular 9 to 5 job. Actually, it's a 7 to 4 job, but we won't get into that. And I'm telling you, the last 2 years, I feel like I've regained my ability to hear from God again. I was getting all of my God stuff from the lead guy, and actually became a little bit callous to hearing the Holy Spirit in my life because I didn't have to, because I was told what to do and how to do it. So I know exactly what you're saying. When you take a step back, when you feel like you have a ministry call in your life, and then you take a step back, and people will say that you're just working a secular job. Actually, that can be one of the most healthy things that we can do to refuel, find out who we are, find out in an area of what we actually really do believe. And it kind of starts us off on an ability to hear from God again and be in a place to where we can get direction and we know that it's not being manipulated by uh, a ministry organization or a pastor
Yeah.
who's trying to get us to act or work or do a certain thing. So,
Yeah.
man, that story you just told makes my heart hurt,
Yeah.
be, because I can just feel your pain in that, because you basically put it all on the line and you were just an employee.
Yeah. And the trend I'm seeing throughout your story, Sam, which really breaks my heart, and it really kind of came to a height at this church, was you were visible, but you weren't known. You weren't really known. And a lot of people, like, you're such a genuine, kind, and you, you like to give people the benefit of the doubt, and you're just so genuine and kind. But churches should champion not just making people visible, but allowing people to feel truly known. It's at the heart of koinonia fellowship. It's at the heart of our fellowship as believers. And it just seems like in these early years of you being a believer and these early years of being in ministry, you didn't get to feel that, and you didn't get prioritized in that sense. Like you said, it's a theater. Anything that maybe people did to quote unquote see you may have been for show or to check off a box or to fulfill an HR duty or something like that, or to uphold a culture. But that's something I'm seeing in a lot of mega church cultures is once you get involved in the staff, you become, like you said, a cog in the machine, and you're used as a part to make the whole beast run. and it very rarely goes beyond that. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I would.
So, here's my question. Here's my question for Sam. What's next?
Uh, um, to be honest, I think I think from a personal standpoint, if I'm being really transparent, um, I think a lot of my faith was a house of cards in a lot of ways. I mean, obviously, the churches did play a role. People in the churches did play a role. Um, but I do know that God is tearing down a lot of my views of faith in church and then rebuilding them back again. So, um, answering your question, I think um, I know music is really my most primary calling, and so God has really been moving in my heart for that. I've been focusing more on guitar and setting up a little home studio. Um, and the other thing that I like from an academic side that I want to do is explore, really explore psychology, and see where I just feel like there's a vacuum in terms of how young people are making meaning of their lives, and so I'm imagining something where it could be an organization in a church, it could be an organization outside a church, that just addresses and helps young people develop a narrative for their lives and draw meaning and teach them how to deal with pain as well, or start to address, to think about pain.
All right, so Samuel, I have a question. You talked about your mental health, and I know that for me, with what I went through, I tried to handle some things on my own, and it wasn't until I sought outside help through uh, pastors that went to other churches. Through I actually went to a therapist. I did some other things. So, is there anything that you've done for yourself? I know you said you wanted to help counsel. What kind of help have you gotten, if any?
No, good question. I've initially, I mean, I think it started around my second year of college. So this was in 2014, maybe 2015. And I didn't understand it because I would just get short of breath randomly, and I didn't really understand it. And so I didn't do much about it for until probably until 2017. I started seeing a counselor, a Christian counselor. That did help a bit, but I don't know if counselors can help deal with clinical depression, which I would learn later that it was clinical depression. So it helped a little bit. He addressed a lot of the surface issues. But then it really got to a breaking point, I think, when I was in a relationship. Um, um, it, it'd be really hard for me to get out of bed, and I'd get really anxious, and I would get really angry as well. And so on a trip to India in 2017, when I got sick, my health was just bad. That's when I went to a psychiatrist and I got some medicine, and I came back and I started seeing a psychologist at Fuller Theological Seminary, and that helped a little bit. Um, and then I finally found a psychologist, actually from my church, 3434 in Tulsa, that really she saw me for free. I think she charged about $130 typically, but she gave me like 12 sessions for free, and she gave me these books. Um, and that was what helped me, I think, from she formed this dialectic with me and addressed a lot of the issues and the traumatic experiences that I might have had leading up to that
Oh,
point.
that's fantastic. Thanks for sharing that. We tell people if you need help, get help, and sometimes it's outside of the church because
Yeah.
uh, I think we all wish that sometimes we can just pray things away, and sometimes we need to go to a doctor.
Yeah.
Hmm.
No,
So
I would
Sam,
say
we got
recently, what's been helping me a lot. So my immunity is really bad, and so I had to get off the medicine because I had this withdrawal at one point. And recently, what I've been doing is exercising has been so helpful. And I have been reading old, like just Carl Jung and things like that, authors like that, who say a lot of times depression, anxiety can be a symptom that there's an underlying neuroses where really, um, you're not really living out your whole full purpose. So my depression almost it for when I'm consistently engaging in music, when I'm living out my deepest, what I believe is my deepest purpose or my deepest calling, I feel I very rarely get depressed. So I mean that's just one last thing that I wanted to add in terms.
A reminder to everyone listening that neither Joseph and I are trained psychologists or therapists.
Neither am I.
Okay.
This is just
Yeah.
Go ahead,
personal
Joseph.
advice.
We're going
Yeah.
to wrap
So
this up.
yeah, one of the last questions I have for you, Sam. You mentioned at the beginning that you have learned a lot about the importance and almost beauty of pain. How much of that process did you learn along this journey of experiencing, quite frankly, rejection, being overlooked, um, seen but not known in these churches, and just your journey in general? Can you describe what you've learned about the importance of pain? And then the second question I have after that is if you could give any piece of advice for people in a megachurch, specifically HR or people involved in that staff culture, of what they could do differently to help people feel not just seen but known. If you could answer those two questions, pain and how to be known in a megachurch.
Wow, big questions, man.
Yeah.
The first question, I think in terms of pain, your faith really isn't faith, unless it's, I think, doused, drowned, in pain. I can't say I'm on the other side, right? I'm still learning. I'm still growing. I'm still learning what faith can look like in everyday life. Um, but um, I think God is the biggest iconoclast, and he can reveal his answers in any way, shape, or form. But I would say the one thing about pain is, this is going to sound really cliche, but just stop trying to run from it. Because I mean, if you think about it in the long term, you embracing your pain, I think, enables you to live to your fullest potential as a human, and that it also enables you to connect. You're so much more grounded. So people out in the world who are outside the church will be able to relate to you. You'll be able to relate to them. So that's just, I mean, that's a very small snippet of, I think, the benefits of dealing with your pain through art, through writing, through engaging with your purpose, through asking the deeper questions. Um, at least for me personally. I hope that answers that question you just asked.
No, that's really good.
We'll do another. We can do an entire episode, I think, on pain, maybe later. But the second question, I would say, I think we as a church have made love as a means to an end. And I
Mm.
think as long as love is a means to an end, it's not love anymore. Love needs to come from just, I think Jesus giving his love to us and us acting in response to that love. And so that sounds really simplistic, but I think oftentimes we love in order for something else to happen, in order for them to feel part of the church, in order for them to feel part of this social club, in order for them to work for the church or volunteer for the church, in order for them to even be saved.
Wow.
Because that can even be something that's fulfilling your sense of accomplishment. And I think this goes back to something
Mm.
Kierkegaard said, from the scripture in James, where double-minded man receives nothing. And he talks about how Soren Kierkegaard, this Danish philosopher, existentialist, talks about how the purity of heart is to will one thing, and that's really been an impactful thing for me. So when you're loving, you're just responding out of God's love, that the love that God has, I mean, I guess, shown you. without any ulterior motive at all. And I think that's where true redemption comes and true salvation comes.
Wow. And Eddie, I mean, how often do you think spiritual abuse is guised under love as a means to an end? I know all of your corrections were framed as loving, like um, not as rejection, but protection and direction. And it's just, I think we can all take what Sam said as something to ponder on. It's like really pondering our motives in reaching people and
Yeah, that's
investing in
really good
people.
stuff because it kind of goes with what I said in my podcast where we were talking about the vision of a church, running over people. And you have to, when you've got a vision of a church and it's trying to get people involved in doing things, uh, you kind of get off the vision that the church is the people that are there and it's
Yeah.
all about connection and love and everything else. And it's guised in a what can we get people to do? How can we help them do this? When really it's kind of focusing them to do what the church wants them to do. And that can be so frustrating for people. So I think what Samuel shared was just really profound. And then the fact that he's quoting philosophers shows that he's so much more intelligent than you and I are, Joseph. So, um, and more educated. So, it's just amazing stuff. And I think what quick story. I was in Russia and I heard someone singing "Shout to the Lord" in a church service, and it was in Russian. And that day, it made me see how small the world really is. And when, here we are doing a podcast with Samuel, who's in India, but yet we all have the same focus and the same end game, which is, it's just simply Jesus. And I think sometimes the church gets in the way of that.
Yeah. So, Sam, thank you for being on the Spiritual Abuse Podcast. I know your laptop is like 2% right
So
now.
sorry, guys.
So
Just
you're,
gotta get a new laptop.
you dropped a lot of gold on this podcast. So we just want to say thank you for sharing your experience, being vulnerable about, your pain. And yeah, just thank you for jumping on the podcast.
My pleasure,
Any
man.
last words?
And honestly, this was so freeing, and this was healing for me to have two people to genuinely getting to know and really hear me out and work through some of this. I know you guys aren't psychologists, but yeah, I really appreciate your time and your investment. And I think you're doing really, really important kingdom work. So please continue doing, even if it's yeah, it's quality over quantity. So just
Yeah,
please keep doing it.
you got
Thank
it,
you,
man.
Samuel.
It's our honor.
Yeah.
All
Thanks,
right.
guys.
Do you want to? Yeah, you want to close
Yeah,
us out, Eddie?
and my house is always open to you if you want to come back. We've got room if you're ever in Tennessee.
They've got a bigger house now.
We've got a bigger house, and we can hook you up. And in all seriousness, you're welcome here anytime if you ever end up in the United States. And we would love to host you and see you again. But we just can't thank you enough. And I know you're now at 1%, but one of the things Joseph and I were texting about the other day is our podcast. It's not like we're trying to get 10 million listeners. That's not what we're trying to do. I think simply what we're doing is giving people a voice. And
Right.
in that, there's this healing that's taking place because it just helps me, helps Joseph, it's helped our other guests, and I just thank you being a part of it.
Yeah. And Sam, if you need to jump off because of your laptop,
Yeah,
that's
I'm gonna head
totally
out.
fine.
I would, yeah, I look forward to being on this again. If you guys invite me again, decide to, you can discuss it. But yeah, thank you
Absolutely.
so much.
All
Thanks,
right.
everybody.
Be blessed. Closing thoughts. Just one thing I want to say about Sam's story is the spiritual abuse that he experienced. It had a heightened sense at that last church, but a lot of it was subdued, and a lot of it, like he expressed, was feelings of isolation, feelings of not being known over prolonged periods of time that actually exacerbated issues in his life. And like he said, we're not blaming everything in his life on the church, but there's a basic human need of wanting to feel feel a part of something, feel that sense of belonging, and feeling unconditional love. And I think what Sam shared was profoundly posing the question of what is unconditional love, like truly living and loving without condition. And what I just want to pose to our listeners is don't underestimate the injustices that you're experiencing in your life, even if they're not dramatic, even if they're not explicitly overt, because over time, we're seeing in stories like Sam's and stories like Christian and Stephanie's, over time, this can really affect you and cause some problems. Eddie, any thoughts on that?
No, I agree with you 100%. And I just trying to put into words, you see people that are just such good people. And for listeners, Sam is off now. He had to bail due to his laptop being out of juice. So we're not going to try to make this any longer than it needs to be. But I see people who just have good hearts and they want to be a part of something that's bigger than them and they want to serve Jesus. And then they get involved with something and I'm not saying that life, I have a secular job and sometimes things at my job don't go the way I want and I have to deal with things. But we're talking about the church. It's the
Yeah.
church and it just needs to do better.
Yeah, there's something about the spiritual depth that you entrust to a pastor and to a church that is a level of trust of the deepest part, like your spirit. And it's when you make yourself that vulnerable, you also open yourself up to a world of hurt when you're not stewarded correctly. And again, we're not blaming all of our problems or everything on the church, but like Eddie said, the church just needs to do better. So, Eddie, do you want to close us out?
No, I'm going to let you close this out because you do such a good job with all the where to contact us and how to let us know what's going on. And so I'll let you handle all that
Okay,
stuff.
all right. Well, thanks again for listening to the Spiritual Abuse Podcast. We hope that this episode made you think. Again, we want to hear your story. We want to hear about how this podcast is affecting you. We're on Twitter at abuse_podcast. You can email us your story or your feedback at thespiritualabusepodcast@gmail.com. If you're watching on YouTube, be sure to like our video, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you can know whenever we're releasing a new podcast. But like Eddie said, our heart is just to provide a space for people, no matter what, to have that voice and to have that validation for our listeners that you're not crazy and that there is hope here. So thanks again. Be blessed, and we'll see you next week.